Following a video I did a couple of weeks back, I'm gonna turn it into a full series now, and that is exploring the world of Robin of Sherwood, because it's a TV series I grew up with and I really enjoyed watching, and it's so well written in the sense that you've got the kind of historical references and side of things in it, as well as the mythological side of things, using a lot of different myths and legends. And I thought it would be really interesting to delve into that and go into that deeper in a way that the TV series, obviously, because it wasn't a documentary about medieval life or um, mythology, go into where Richard Carpenter found those stories and where they came from and what inspired Robin of Sherwood, essentially. That's what we're going to do today. And if you don't know what Robin of Sherwood is, it was a TV series from the 80s produced by HTV, written by Richard Carpenter mainly. He had some other writers that came and wrote a bit. And it starred Michael Prayard, Jason Connery, Judy Trott, Ray Winston, people like that, Clive Mantle. There's so many other, Nicholas Grace. I could go on and just do the entire cast, but we're not got the time for that. So I thought we would start at the very beginning with the first episode of Robin Sherwood. Oh, and by the way, I know I look mental in a jumper and gloves. It's really weird weather. It cannot tell if it's hot or if it's cold. I've got the patio door window thing open because it feels slightly hot, but then I've got cold, so I put gloves on. Anyway, let's get into the video. I've got notes, so if you see me reading, it's because I'm reading the notes. I have ADHD, possibly. I have suspected ADHD. We are going through the motions to work this out at the moment, and dyslexia, so I feel more confident if I'm reading my notes because I want to get this 100% correct, because I feel that I'm confident in saying that I'm quite knowledgeable historically and mythologically, but I'm not a historian and I don't specialise in history or myths in any capacity. It's just my interests. I'm a hobbyist. So I want to make sure it's as correct as can be. So I'm going to read off of a script that I've written. I'm going to start with the first episode of Robin of Sherwood, which is Robin Hood and the Sorcerer, Part 1. And we're only going to cover Part 1 today, and I'll cover Part 2 a different day. Now, we see Robin as a boy in his home village of Locksley as Norman soldiers are burning the village to the ground. We also see his father, Alric, being killed, and he is killed because he rebels against the Normans and is anti-Norman rule. So our first place to start, I feel, when talking about Robin of Sherwood is what it was like in that time period, what Norman rule was like. And Robin of Sherwood takes place during Richard the Lionheart's reign, during his rule of England, sometime between 1189 and 1199. Richard the Lionheart only ruled, or Richard the First only ruled for 10 years. And England was deep in Norman rule at this time, 123 years, I believe, to be exact. And the beginning of Norman rule was a fair bit before then. It was after the Battle of Hastings in 1066. But the Norman rule did show huge changes in the way things worked, with William the Conqueror bringing in the feudal system. Now, the feudal system was a system based upon royal strength and the power of the king. Before the Normans, the Anglo-Saxons worked on a system where land was given in exchange for duties. Now, William the Conqueror owned all land in England and essentially put people on that land to look after it and gave them that land to look after it, with them knowing that he still technically owned it, essentially. And this would be members of the clergy and lords and barons. These noblemen would in turn give land to knights who would raise an army to fight for the king. These Noblemen would then also let peasants live and work the land in return for taxes and food, making the noblemen very, very wealthy. Peasants were considered the lowest part of society and had very little rights. Peasants' lives were heavily controlled by those above them in society. So this would be the nobility, the church, and the king. Overall, this kind of meant that everyone was a tenant to someone. So the noblemen were tenants to the king, and then the peasants were tenants to the noblemen. So that's basically what the feudal system looked like. If you were a woman in this time, things were especially hard. You lost even more rights. After the Battle of Hastings, a lot of land was obviously handed to women in the sense that, well, that was what expected to happen. It didn't happen. But they lost their fathers or their husbands or their brothers, so the land went to them. But this didn't happen. William the Conqueror kind of gave them an ultimatum where it was, you can keep your land, but you have to marry a Norman nobleman in order to do so. So that kind of happened, so people can inherit land. There were many rebellions against the Norman rule in the kind of early days, with the biggest rebellion being in York in 1069. To manage the unpopularity with English people, the Normans quickly built motte and bailey castles out of wood at this time. Castles were built in prominent positions on high ground overlooking villages or towns. These would have been huge, big, imposing structures that everyone in the surrounding lands would see, possibly the biggest structure a medieval person would have ever seen. Norman rule was clearly a time of change and inequality. From the start of William the Conqueror's rule till the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215, although unfair taxes did still continue, that it wasn't a sort all. Robin of Sherwood takes place before the Magna Carta, but it's important to mention the Magna Carta, that was where people were leading to, that was what people wanted, because the Magna Carta set out how powerful decisions would be made between monarch and powerful nobility, taking some of the power away from the monarch. So Robin of Sherwood takes place only a few years before this. Well, a few years before this, since that was during the reign of John, who is Richard's brother. So Robin of Sherwood takes place during Richard the Lionheart's rule. And despite being called the Lionheart and almost being romanticised in literature and film, he was an absent monarch. So if you picture it, you're a medieval peasant, you've had a lot of changes during the Norman rule, everything's different, and then you have a king who just doesn't want to essentially spend any time in England. In fact, he only spent about 6 months here. He was much more interested in going and fighting the Crusades. He also didn't produce an heir, which would have worried people, because you don't know what's going to happen next, who's going to rule, type thing. So that's kind of the feelings in the Norman era. Carrying on with following the episode itself, we jump forward 15 years and we see an adult Robin having been fostered by the local miller. And then he is caught poaching in Sherwood Forest with Much, the miller's son, and are brought to the dungeons of Nottingham Castle. So what was hunting deer and poaching like in Norman England? Well, under Norman rule, a few laws were enforced, including laws about murder, women, and forest laws. So we're going to focus on forest laws because we don't need to think about the others at this point in time. The forest laws were unpopular as they made activities allowed on common land in Anglo-Saxon England illegal. The Normans declared that all royal forests belonged to the king, giving him exclusive hunting rights and control over resources within, which people had obviously previously relied on those resources. Now the people of England were not allowed to graze animals, fell trees, hunt, own dogs, or own a bow and arrow in the forest. More than this, they were not allowed to hunt deer and were punished by having their first two fingers cut off, these two, so that they couldn't use a bow, or making it pretty impossible to use a bow. If it was a repeat offence, the punishment was being blinded, so quite gruesome. This was particularly hard for peasants, as they were now prohibited from using the forest for essential resources like firewood and game. Going on to the fact that I've mentioned Nottingham Castle, I feel that it's pretty obvious that the Nottingham Castle you're seeing in Robin of Sherwood isn't actually Nottingham Castle, but Nottingham Castle, as in the real castle, was built in 1068 by William the Conqueror as a way to assert his control over his new territory. This castle was a wooden Motte and Bailey castle, but during the reign of Henry II, the castle was then rebuilt out from stone, making it more long-term. But the Nottingham Castle that's used in Robin of Sherwood is actually many different filming locations. Instead of the actual castle, which you couldn't really film in, it wouldn't really work. They used Alnwick Castle in Northumberland, Brent Castle, Pro Cathedral in Clifton, Tithe Barn, Bradford upon Avon, and Wells Cathedral were also used. You see the scene where Robin meets Lady Marian and runs up the stairs there, that is Wells Cathedral. Following the story, the episode along, we then see Robin break out of prison along with some other prisoners. And these prisoners include Will Scarlet. And it's the first time we kind of meet his character. And then he goes off to the forest and creates a band of outlaws. Now, let's talk about outlaws and what an outlaw was in this time period that Robin of Sherwood is set in. Firstly, the term outlaw means a person deemed unworthy of the protection of the law. This is a person who is essentially excommunicated from those who knew them, as well as the church. If you think about how prominent religion was in that time period, that wasn't a good thing. That wasn't a thing to strive for. A lot of outlaws, especially in Sherwood, were outlawed as a result of forest law. The Sherwood Forest Ear courts have records surviving from 1287 and 1334 that tell us about outlaws and that support the fact that a lot of people were outlawed as a result of the forest laws. It wasn't uncommon for outlaws to form groups, especially after the events of 1066, because you had a lot of people that were losing their land and status and obviously didn't want to conform to like the new rule. An example of a group that we have actual historical kind of evidence for was the outlaw Hereward the Wake kind of group that he led. Hereward the Wake was an Anglo-Saxon rebel who rebelled against William the Conqueror, whose history has, granted, been muddled with legend and myth, but he is a good example of someone who led a group of outlaws. Groups like these of outlaws were referred to as Silvaticae, or men of the wood, by Normans. Robin Hood himself we're not going to go into the kind of history and people that could have inspired the stories. We're not going into that, but the name Robin Hood was a common term or nickname or alias used for outlaws. Robin or Robert, Hood, Hod or Hewd was a nickname given to petty criminals. The term Robin Hood for an outlaw was used mainly in the 13th century. We see Robin getting chosen by the forest god Herne the Hunter.
Who are you?
Told you.
You're no god.
We can all of us be gods. All of us.
And Robin is given a sword called Albion.
Albion. One of the 7 swords of Wayland. Charged with the power of light and darkness.
We now need to talk about Albion and Wayland the Smith. I will do a more in-depth video on this at some point. I'll either do a separate video on Wayland the Smith, or I will do it later when talking about a different episode of Robin of Sherwood. But in the TV show, Albion is obviously the sword, and it's mentioned that it's one of 7 swords of Wayland. Now, this refers to the myth of Wayland the Smith, and this myth or legend is considered Scandinavian, Germanic and Anglo-Saxon in origin. His story is also told in the 13th century Icelandic Elder or Poetic Edda. He is also mentioned in Anglo-Saxon poetry and writing, including Beowulf, which obviously predates the Icelandic Poetic Edda. In these legends, Wayland is a smith of outstanding skill. He created magical weapons for gods and heroes, including the sword. Gram used to slay Fafnir. Sometimes it's written to be that he is the lord of elves. To briefly go into the story, or a version of the story about Wayland, Wayland was the son of a giant, a god giant. He was captured by a Swedish king and forced to work in the king's smithy, which obviously he didn't like because he was forced against his will. I'm going to state here, because I feel it's important, that Wayland isn't necessarily a good character. I wouldn't put him up with the morals of Robin. He's not a nice person. I know he was captured. Hello, Kitty. I know he was captured and forced to work in a smithy against his will, but his response to this was to kill the Swedish king's 2 sons, and more than kill their 2 sons, he kind of decided not to waste the death and turn their skulls into bowls, which he promptly gave to the king, their father. He also, how do I put this in a way that isn't going to get me in trouble on YouTube? I'm just going to use the word attacked. He also attacked the king's daughter. He escapes prison by fashioning, his imprisonment, in what he escapes from the Swedish king by creating a pair of wings or a cape made from feathers in which he could fly off with. So that's kind of who Wayland the Smith is. And obviously 7 swords are spoken about in Robin Hood, and I'll cover that in a different video. But I feel that we should talk a bit about Albion, the sword Albion, because it is interesting. If you look at the sword, it's got kind of Celtic knotworking as well as some runes, which are obviously 2 separate things and culturally 2 different things. The design of the sword isn't, however, like a sword of a Celt or like swords of Celts. It's more like a 12th or 13th century arming sword. The runes in the Celtic knots almost represent a pre-Christian faith and a pre-Christian time, I feel, in the show, and it kind of links the fact that they want a time before the Normans, as much as the Normans there was Christianity in England before the Normans. Obviously, it happened during the Anglo-Saxon period, because when the Anglo-Saxons came over, they weren't originally Christian, but they did become Christianized. But the sword cut, to me, I feel, is supposed to represent a time that they want to go back to. And this, I feel, is made obvious by the fact it's called Albion, with Albion being used as a kind of poetic and literacy term for Britain or England, and it feels like they're trying to almost harken back to that time, to that, in their view, idyllic time, a time before the Normans. So that's me talking about the sword, Albion. I'll go into depth about Waylon and the Seven Swords in a different video. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I really enjoyed researching it. I'm sorry that I have to read notes so clearly, because my brain, I've got a butterfly brain. I'd be all over the place if I didn't. I really hope you did enjoy this. Let me know if you want me to do videos on different topics, in the sense that, can you go into depth more about Richard the Lionheart or something like that, if you know what I mean. Thank you for watching. I hope you have a good day.